Isabella Moretti had learned a long time ago that poverty made every decision feel heavier than it should. At 24, she worked 2 jobs in Venice and still counted coins before buying bread. In the mornings, she cleaned a small private medical office near Santa Croce. In the evenings, she did alterations for a costume workshop that supplied gowns and capes to wealthy clients who treated silk like paper and money like air. She came home every night with aching hands, sore shoulders, and the same quiet fear pressing at the back of her mind. One missed payment, one broken appliance, one medical emergency, and her entire life would collapse. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building in Cannaregio. The walls were damp, the windows rattled when the wind turned sharp, and the heating worked only when it felt merciful. But it was still home, because her father was there. Giorgio Moretti had once repaired antique clocks for some of the richest people in Venice. Now he was half blind after a stroke, proud to the point of cruelty toward himself, and deeply uncomfortable with the fact that his daughter had become the one carrying their life on her back. He tried not to complain. Izzy tried not to let him see how afraid she was. Most days, that was the best either of them could manage. That Thursday had already gone badly before the phone rang. The owner of the workshop had delayed her pay again. The pharmacist had refused to extend credit for one of her father's medications. And when Izzy had returned to the medical office late in the evening, to pick up the scarf she had forgotten in the staff closet, she had found the lobby in chaos. 2 paramedics were pushing a gurney through the side entrance with the speed of men who knew seconds mattered. A nurse sprinted ahead, another shouted for plasma, and 3 men in dark suits followed so closely behind the patient that they looked less like concerned companions and more like armed shadows. Izzy stepped instinctively out of the way, flattening herself against the wall as the gurney rushed past. She saw blood first, too much of it. It had soaked through the blanket at the man's side and stained the sheet beneath him. A ventilator mask covered part of his face, but not enough to hide the hard line of his jaw or the bruising already forming near his temple. He looked to be in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, strong, broad, expensively dressed beneath the torn shirt, the sort of man who had never once been mistaken for harmless. Then, just as the gurney passed the blood collection room, his eyes opened. Izzy felt that look like a physical thing. He was losing blood. He was clearly in pain. He should have looked weak, disoriented, half gone already. Instead, his eyes moved fast and cold, scanning everything around him, the corridor, the doors, the men with him, the nurse near the trauma room, before stopping on her. It lasted no more than a second, but there was nothing helpless in that glance. Then he was gone, pushed through the double doors at the end of the hall, followed by the men in suits and the smell of antiseptic and gunpowder. Izzy stared after them, pulse hammering. "Don't just stand there!" snapped a voice behind her. She turned to find Nurse Paula from the night desk, hurrying toward the donor records cabinet with a tablet in one hand and a phone pressed to her ear. Paula rarely lost control of her expression, but tonight there was real fear on her face. "We need an O-negative donor now," Paula told whoever was on the line. "No, not tomorrow. Now." Izzy's stomach tightened. Her own blood type was O-negative. She had registered as a voluntary donor 2 years earlier after her father's stroke. Mostly because the neurologist had once said, almost casually, that blood shortages cost people time, and sometimes time was the only thing standing between a family and disaster. The line had stayed with her. So she had signed up, donated when she was healthy enough, and told herself that even poor girls had something valuable to give. Paula ended the call, looked up, and saw her. For a second, both women froze. Then Paula crossed the room in 3 quick steps. "You're still on the donor list, aren't you?" Izzy swallowed. "Yes." "You're O-negative?" "Yes." Paula gripped her forearm. "Good. I need you." Izzy looked toward the trauma doors. "Who is he?" Paula's eyes flicked toward the hallway. Her voice dropped. "A man with the kind of enemies that make hospitals dangerous." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I'm giving." Izzy hesitated. "I worked since 6 this morning. I haven't eaten properly. What if they don't clear me?" Paula held her gaze. "He may die before I find someone else. It should not have mattered who the man was. It should not have mattered how expensive his watch was, or how many armed men had followed him in, or how dangerous his eyes had looked. Blood loss made everyone equal. That was the terrible simplicity of it. Enough left the body, and rich men died just like poor ones. Still, something inside her resisted, not because she wanted the stranger dead, because she had spent too many years watching people like him move through the world as if other people's lives were furniture. Because she knew, with the instinct of the powerless, that men surrounded by silence and fear rarely brought peace anywhere they went. Then she thought of her father in the rehabilitation ward after his stroke, waiting 3 extra hours for a transfusion that should have already been there. She remembered sitting beside his bed, praying for a bag of blood as if it were a miracle. The memory left no room for selfishness. "Fine," she said quietly. "Tell me what to do." 10 minutes later, Izzy was in the donor chair with a pressure cuff on her arm and a form she had barely read. Another nurse checked her weight, frowned, then looked toward the window where one of the suited men stood outside in the hall. He did not speak. He did not need to. The nurse set the clipboard down and continued preparing the needle, Memberd sitting beside his bed, praying for a bag of blood as if it were a miracle. The memory left no room for selfishness. "Fine," she said quietly. "Tell me what to do." 10 minutes later, Izzy was in the donor chair with a pressure cuff on her arm and a form she had barely read. Izzy hated needles. She always had. But tonight, she hated the stillness more. The strange sense that everyone around her was pretending this was routine when it clearly was not. "Has he got family?" she asked, mostly to distract herself. The nurse glanced up. "I wouldn't ask questions. So he's powerful." The nurse said nothing. "That usually means yes." The woman tied the band around Izzy's arm. "Close your fist." Izzy did. The needle slid in. She winced, then looked away as the blood began to move through the tube into the bag. There was something deeply unsettling about watching your own blood leave your body in silence. It made you aware of how fragile everything really was. A little too much gone, and there would be no more overdue rent, no more sewing late at night, no more pretending to her father that things were manageable, just absence. She stared at the filling bag, then thought again of the man on the gurney and his violent, furious eyes. A man like that did not seem built for endings. Men like that expected the world to delay death on command. "Is he conscious?" she asked. "On and off. Does he know someone is donating?" The nurse gave her a strange look. "I assume he knows someone is trying to keep him alive." Izzy looked down at the label resting on the tray. Before she could overthink it, she reached for the pen beside the forms and wrote 2 words in small, slanted Italian near the lower corner. "Non morire." Don't die. The nurse noticed, opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. She took the label and attached it without comment. By the time the donation ended, Izzy's head felt light and her hands were cold. She drank the orange juice they gave her, forced herself to eat the dry biscuit, and stayed seated until the room stopped tilting. Outside the hall, the same men in dark suits were still waiting. One of them took the blood bag from the nurse with both hands, almost reverently, and disappeared toward the trauma room. Izzy stood carefully, pressing gauze to the inside of her elbow. On her way out, she passed the small consultation area near the operating suite, just as one of the doctors pushed through the swinging doors. He was peeling off gloves and speaking quickly to a silver-haired man in a black coat, whose back was turned toward her. "We stopped the bleeding for now," the doctor said. "But if there's another complication," the older man cut him off. "There won't be." The doctor looked exhausted. "That is not how medicine works." The man turned slightly then, enough for Izzy to see a profile as hard and elegant as carved stone. He wasn't the patient. He was older, maybe a lawyer or advisor, the kind of man who had spent decades standing close to power and borrowing its shape. His gaze moved over Izzy once, cold and assessing, then returned to the doctor. "Tonight," he said, "medicine will work." The doctor's expression tightened. But he said nothing more. Izzy left before anyone could stop her. She had no desire to be noticed in that building 1 second longer than necessary. Outside, the cold air hit her face like a slap. Venice was quieter now, the streets nearly empty, the water dark under the street lamps. She wrapped her scarf tighter around her throat and started home on foot. She could have taken the Vaporetto, but she needed movement more than comfort. As she walked, she tried to convince herself the night was over. She had donated blood. That was all. A good deed for a stranger. A necessary act in an emergency. By morning, the man would either be alive or dead, and in either case, her part in it would be finished. That was what she told herself. Then she unlocked the apartment door just after 1 a.m. and found her father still awake in his chair, head turned toward the sound of her steps. "You're late," Giorgio said, "and you smell like a hospital." Izzy closed the door quietly behind her. "I had to stop somewhere after work." "What happened?" She pulled off her coat and tried to sound calm. "Someone needed blood." His face changed instantly. "And you gave it?" "Yes." He let out a slow breath, part frustration, part fear. "Izzy, I know." She crouched beside his chair and took his hand before he could finish. "I know I should have eaten more. I know you'll say I can't keep giving from an empty body, but someone was dying." Giorgio was silent for a moment. Then he squeezed her fingers once. "And did they live?" Izzy thought of the man's eyes opening on the gurney, of the blood on the sheets, of the men in dark coats waiting outside the donor room like violence on pause. "I don't know," she said. She stood, moved toward the kitchenette, and reached for the kettle. Her arm ached where the needle had gone in. Her rent was still overdue. Her father still needed medicine she could not yet pay for. Nothing in her life had materially improved in the last 2 hours. And yet, without being able to explain why. She felt certain of one thing. The night was not over. It had only moved ahead of her. Izzy slept badly and woke worse. The donation had drained what little strength she had left, and her body punished her for it. Her arm was sore. Her head felt heavy. Every time she drifted into real sleep, she saw flashes of blood on white sheets, and those dark, controlled eyes, opening at the exact moment they should have been giving in. By the time morning light pushed through the thin curtains, she felt like she had not rested at all. She rose quietly so she would not wake her father and went straight to the sink to splash water on her face. For a few moments, she let herself pretend the day would be ordinary. She would make coffee, toast stale bread, help her father with his medicine, then go to the workshop and ask again about the wages Bellini still owed her. Maybe she could convince the pharmacist to wait another 48 hours. Maybe the landlord would allow one more week. Maybe. Her life was built on weak promises and extensions she had no right to expect. She had just set the kettle on the stove when someone knocked at the door. Not tapped, knocked. 3 measured, deliberate knocks that carried something stronger than impatience. Authority, maybe, or certainty. Izzy froze. Visitors almost never came to the apartment without warning. The landlord shouted from the hallway. Neighbors called through the wall. Delivery boys leaned on the bell downstairs until someone opened. But this knock was different. Calm. Controlled. Like the person on the other side already knew the door would eventually open. Behind her, Giorgio stirred in his chair. He slept there sometimes when his legs hurt too badly to climb into bed. "Who is it?" he asked, voice rough with sleep. "I don't know," she said, and hated how strange she sounded. The knock came again, the same rhythm as before. Izzy wiped her damp hands on her skirt and moved toward the door. She should have looked through the peephole first, but the peephole had been broken for months, and the landlord kept saying he would fix it after Carnival. She placed her hand on the knob and stopped. Something felt wrong. The lock was smoother than before. She stared at it. Then she understood why. It had been changed. Not repaired. Changed. The cheap brass cylinder the landlord had threatened to replace last winter was gone. In its place was a new polished lock she had never seen before. A chill moved down her back. She turned it slowly and opened the door. The man standing in the hallway was not wearing a suit. He had on a dark wool coat left open over a black shirt, the collar slightly loose, as if he had dressed in a hurry. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and pale in the way men looked when they had lost too much blood and refused to rest anyway. A faint bruise marked one cheekbone. There was a cut near his hairline, and even before he lifted his face fully into the light, Izzy knew him. Not from rumor, from the hospital, from the gurney, from those eyes. They were the same, dark, steady, disturbingly awake. The eyes of a man who did not ask rooms to make space for him, because rooms did it on their own. Beside him stood another man, younger, leaner, watchful in a way that felt almost military. He wore a gray overcoat and gloves, and kept one hand near his pocket, not casually, but because whatever was in that pocket mattered. Izzy gripped the edge of the door. "Who are you?" The injured man studied her for one quiet second, then answered in a low, even voice. "Lorenzo Ricci." The name hit like cold water. In Venice, people whispered about Lorenzo, Enzo Ricci, the way people whispered about storms, floods, or political scandals, something real, dangerous, and better discussed in private. He owned nightclubs, construction companies, shipping routes no one could ever fully map. Officially, he was a businessman. Unofficially, he was the answer to questions no honest person asked twice. Men disappeared around him. Judges became cooperative. Entire families moved apartments without explaining why. And yet none of that was what terrified her most. It was the fact that he was standing outside her door less than 12 hours after she had donated blood to a dying stranger. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "No," he said. "I shouldn't." He did not sound apologetic. He sounded tired. Giorgio was fully awake now. "Izzy?" Lorenzo's gaze shifted past her shoulder into the apartment and landed on the old man in the chair. Something unreadable passed through his expression. Not pity, not condescension, something sharper. Then he looked back at Izzy. "May I come in?" "No." The answer came too fast, too sharp, but she did not regret it. Lorenzo nodded once as if her refusal had been expected. "Then I'll do this here. The hospital was compromised. Someone sold donor information before dawn. Your name was on that list." Izzy stared at him, not understanding at first. Then understanding hit all at once. "What?" "Your name, your address, likely your father's presence in the residence, possibly more." His voice stayed calm, which somehow made every word worse. "The men who came after me now know who kept me alive." Izzy's mouth went dry. "No. Yes. No," she repeated, shaking her head. "That's impossible." The younger man beside him finally spoke. "It isn't." His accent was Venetian too, but cleaner, educated, the sort that came from private schools and expensive correction. He pulled a folded sheet from his coat pocket and held it out. It was a donor registry printout. Izzy saw her full name on the page, then the building address, then a row of medical notes she had never realized were visible to anyone beyond staff. Her stomach turned. "Who are you?" she asked the younger man. "Matteo Santoro," he said. "I handle Mr. Ricci's security, then handle it somewhere else." His face almost changed. Not quite a smile, but close. That would have been ideal. Lorenzo shifted slightly, and she noticed the smallest tightening at the corner of his mouth. Pain. He was still injured, probably more seriously than he wanted either of them to know. "Why is the lock changed?" she asked. "I changed it." The answer stunned her. "You broke into my apartment." "No," he said. "I paid a locksmith at 6 in the morning. He thought he was helping an estranged husband." Her anger flared hard enough to burn through fear for a second. "You had no right. You are correct." His tone remained steady. "And if I'd had another hour, I wouldn't have done it." "I did not have another hour." Behind her, Giorgio rose shakily from the chair. "Izzy, who is this?" Lorenzo's eyes moved to the older man. He stepped back one pace, enough to show he was not trying to cross the threshold by force. "My name is Lorenzo Ricci. Signore, your daughter helped save my life last night. She is in danger because of it." Giorgio's face changed at once. Confusion vanished. Fear took its place. Izzy heard movement from the stairwell below. Not loud. Just enough to register. More than one set of feet. Someone climbing, trying not to sound like they were climbing. Matteo heard it too. He turned his head slightly, listening, then looked at Lorenzo. 3, maybe 4. Izzy's heartbeat stumbled. Lorenzo's gaze came back to her. "I need you to make a decision now." "No, you don't know the decision yet." "I know enough." The footsteps came again, closer this time. Lorenzo's voice dropped. "If you stay here, they take you. If they want leverage, they may take him too." He nodded toward her father. "If they are under orders to make a message out of you, and they leave bodies, I won't tell you which outcome is more likely, because it won't matter once they are through that door." Giorgio gripped the back of the chair. "Izzy?" She could not think. Her mind was splitting in 10 directions at once. This had to be a trick, or a power play, or madness. But if it were a lie, why was a man like Lorenzo Ricci standing in a damp apartment hallway, bleeding through his shirt to tell it? She looked at him then, really looked. He was too pale. The skin beneath his eyes was shadowed. One hand remained near his side as though holding himself together mattered more than comfort. He had not come with 10 armed men and a convoy of black cars. He had come himself, with one security man and a fresh bandage beneath his collar. That fact frightened her more than any display of force could have, because it meant the threat was real enough that he did not trust anyone else to handle it. The footsteps stopped outside the building's main landing. Matteo reached into his coat and withdrew a compact handgun fitted with a suppressor. He held it low, close to his thigh, and looked at Lorenzo with flat patience. "We are out of time." Izzy's breath caught at the sight of the weapon. "No guns in my home," Giorgio said hoarsely. Lorenzo turned his head slightly. "Then let us leave it." That snapped something in her. "Leave?" she said. "Go where?" "A safe apartment near Giudecca first. Somewhere temporary. Then we decide what happens next." "You decide, you mean?" His gaze sharpened. "No, I am trying very hard not to." The honesty of that unsettled her more than arrogance would have. There was a sound outside the door. Not a knock. A faint scrape, like someone testing the frame. Matteo moved instantly, body angled, gun raised. Lorenzo's voice stayed low and hard. "Izzy." She turned to him. "When you open a vein for a man like me," he said, "the world notices in the worst possible way. I am here before them. That is the only advantage we have left." Another scrape, then silence. Behind her, Giorgio whispered, "Bella, go." She turned. "What?" His blind gaze found the sound of her breathing. "You think I don't understand what this is? Men who move like that do not come for conversation. If this man is telling the truth, you go." Tears stung unexpectedly. "I'm not leaving you." "You are not leaving me," Lorenzo said. "You are taking him with you." Izzy stared. Lorenzo looked toward Matteo. "Get the old man's coat." Matteo moved inside before she could object, crossed to the chair, and lifted Giorgio's heavy winter coat from the armrest. He did it with quick, efficient care, not like a servant, and not like a thug, like a man who understood that panic wasted time. Izzy still had not stepped back from the threshold. Lorenzo lowered his voice further. "This is the last second I can ask nicely." She heard another sound outside, this one unmistakable, the soft metal click of something being tried against the new lock. Her fear finally overtook her anger. She stepped back. Lorenzo crossed the threshold, and in that one small movement, with her father terrified behind her, and armed men outside the door, and the most dangerous man in Venice entering her home because of blood she had given without thinking, Isabella Moretti understood exactly what the title of her life had become. Next morning, she opened the door, and everything changed. Everything after that happened too quickly for fear to stay graceful. Matteo shut the door soundlessly behind Lorenzo, then moved through the apartment with the calm of someone who had already mapped its weaknesses in his head. He looked once toward the kitchen window, once toward the narrow hallway leading to the bedroom, then toward the back door that opened onto a tiny service balcony above the canal. The apartment was too small to defend, and too exposed to escape from cleanly. Izzy could see the conclusion in his face before he said it. Front exit is gone, he murmured. Balcony. Giorgio had gone pale, but to his credit, he did not waste time asking pointless questions. He took the coat Matteo handed him, fumbling only once with the sleeve. Lorenzo noticed. He noticed everything. He had moved only 3 steps into the room, but his presence changed its shape. Even injured, even pale, he made the apartment feel rearranged around him. He stood near the table with one hand braced against the chair back, breath measured, face unreadable, while listening to the faint sounds beyond the door. There was no panic in him, no visible urgency, just a terrible kind of concentration that made Izzy understand why men followed him and why others wanted him dead. "Are they yours?" she asked, hearing how thin her voice sounded. "No. How can you be sure?" "Because mine would knock first." That answer did not comfort her at all. There was a sharp metallic sound from the hallway, then a low curse, muffled through the door. Matteo looked at Lorenzo. They brought tools. Lorenzo nodded once. "We move." He stepped toward Giorgio as if to help him, but Giorgio stiffened and took half a step back. "Don't touch me." Lorenzo stopped immediately. "As you prefer." Something about that, about a man like him actually respecting a refusal, threw Izzy off balance. Matteo was already at the back door, checking the narrow balcony and the rusted stairs bolted to the outer wall. "It'll hold," he said. "Probably." "Probably," Izzy repeated. Matteo looked back at her. This is not the moment to ask for engineering certainty. The sound at the front door grew louder. Giorgio found Izzy's wrist. "Go first," he whispered. "No, Bella." She turned toward him, and in that instant Lorenzo spoke. "You go second," he told her calmly. "Matteo first. Your father next. You last." Izzy stared at him. "And you?" "I'll close up behind us. You can barely stand." His gaze met hers, and for the first time there was something hard enough in it to make her stop speaking. "I can stand long enough." The front lock gave with a violent crack. That broke the last of her resistance. Matteo opened the balcony door. Cold air rushed in off the canal, sharp enough to sting. He stepped out first, tested the iron stair with his weight, then looked back and held out a hand for Giorgio. The old man hated accepting help from anyone, but this time he didn't argue. Matteo guided him onto the stair with surprising patience, one gloved hand firm beneath his elbow. Izzy climbed after them, heart slamming against her ribs. Below, the canal looked black and far too narrow. A boat rocked softly against the opposite wall. Laundry lines stretched between windows above them, forgotten shirts and sheets moving faintly in the wind. Under any other circumstances, the view would have been ordinary. This morning, it looked like a place people vanished. The apartment door burst open behind them. Someone shouted inside. Lorenzo stepped onto the balcony, shut the door behind him, and slid the exterior bolt across with his good hand. It would not hold for long, but it didn't have to. He moved down the stair after her, slower than Matteo, but still controlled, one hand gripping the rail, the other pressed to his side. When they reached the alley at the base of the building, a small delivery boat was waiting where the canal widened just enough to dock. It was old, white, unmarked, and absurdly ordinary. The kind of boat that brought produce to restaurants or laundry to hotels. A man sat behind the wheel in a knit cap, smoking with the blank patience of someone used to terrible mornings. He looked up once at Lorenzo. "You look dead." "Not yet," Lorenzo replied. The boatman nodded toward Giorgio. "That one? He comes too. Then get on." Matteo helped Giorgio into the covered rear compartment first. Izzy climbed in after him, knees weak, bag clutched against her chest. Lorenzo stepped aboard last, and when he did, Izzy saw the brief tightening around his mouth, the split-second loss of color. If she had blinked, she might have missed it. But she didn't miss it. He was holding himself together on discipline alone. The boat pulled away just as voices spilled into the alley above. Izzy ducked instinctively, though the canvas roof concealed them well enough. The engine stayed low and steady, pushing them through the narrow canal with no more urgency than any tradesman making deliveries before noon. Matteo remained near the opening, watching behind them, gun hidden but ready. Giorgio sat rigid on the bench, one hand gripping his cane, the other gripping nothing at all. Izzy looked across the cramped compartment at Lorenzo. He had taken the opposite bench and leaned back against the wood, as if allowing himself that much support cost him something. Up close, he looked worse than he had at the door, too pale, too controlled. The skin at his throat was damp. There was a small stain spreading low on his shirt, where the bandage beneath it had started to give. He caught her looking. "Say it," he said. She blinked. "What?" "The thing you've been trying not to say since I arrived." Her fear hardened into anger fast enough to steady her. "Fine. You had no right to come into my life, scare my father half to death, change my locks, and drag us out of our home like criminals." "No," he said evenly. "I had an obligation." "To who?" "To the woman who kept me from dying on a hospital floor." Izzy's mouth tightened. "That was not a personal favor. I gave blood because someone needed it." His gaze did not leave her face. "I know." "Then stop talking like I belong to some debt chain in your world." "I also know that." She almost laughed from sheer frustration. Do you? Because this looks very much like your world forcing itself on me. Before Lorenzo could answer, Giorgio spoke from beside her. Who are these men? Lorenzo turned toward him with the same unnerving calm. I don't know yet. Matteo answered from the front without looking back, which means he knows enough to be worried. Izzy looked between them. That's not reassuring. It isn't meant to be, Matteo said. Lorenzo kept his eyes on Giorgio. The attack at the hospital was not random. Someone wanted to know whether I lived. When they learned I did, they followed the blood trail to the donor list. You're telling me hospitals keep names that loose? Izzy demanded. They keep records, Lorenzo said. People sell records. Why? This time he did not answer immediately. Because in my world, anything that can be used eventually is. A shipment, a doctor, a debt, a daughter. Giorgio's jaw tightened. My daughter is not yours to use. No, Lorenzo said quietly. That is exactly why we are on this boat. The answer silenced all three of them for a moment. The boat turned into a wider channel and then under a low bridge. Izzy kept waiting for gunshots. Sirens, another boat at their side. Nothing happened. Venice, indifferent as ever, continued around them. Deliveries moved along the canals. A woman leaned out a window shaking a rug. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang the quarter hour. The city had no interest in whether Isabella Moretti had just been pulled out of her life by a wounded Mafia boss, because she had donated blood to him a few hours earlier. The boat docked 20 minutes later behind a shuttered building on Giudecca. From the canal it looked abandoned. Faded plaster, cracked green shutters, no sign above the door. Matteo got out first, checked the narrow courtyard and the side entrance, then nodded them forward. Inside, the building had once been a glass warehouse. It had been converted badly into private apartments sometime in the late 90s and then abandoned halfway through. The lower corridor still smelled faintly of dust and damp wood, but one upper flat had been made fully functional. Clean, furnished, anonymous. There were no personal photos, no decorative objects. Nothing that suggested anyone truly lived there. It was a place meant for disappearing. Matteo led them into the largest room. You stay here for now. Izzy looked around. For how long? That depends. On what? On whether this is a warning, a kidnapping attempt, or the first move in something larger. Lorenzo walked to the table near the window and braced both hands on it. His breath had shortened. He turned his face away for half a second, then back again, as if no one had noticed. Izzy noticed. So did Matteo. You need a doctor, Matteo said. Lorenzo ignored him and looked at Giorgio instead. There is a bedroom to the left. Rest there if you wish. Food will be brought. Your medication, too, if you tell Matteo what is needed. I'm not telling him anything. Matteo sighed softly. Signore, with respect, your choices today are already limited. Try not to make them impossible. Giorgio looked ready to argue, then seemed to remember where he was and with whom. He turned to Izzy instead. You stay where I can hear you. I will. Only when the older man had moved into the bedroom with deliberate, stubborn steps did Izzy turn back to Lorenzo. Now you tell me the truth. A faint smile touched his mouth, humorless and brief. That was the truth. No, that was the edited version powerful men give civilians to keep them obedient. Matteo made a sound that might have been a stifled laugh. Lorenzo shot him one look, and the sound vanished. Then Lorenzo reached inside his coat, removed a folded paper, and set it on the table between them. It was a printout of the donor list again, but this time, Izzy saw a second page beneath it. Security footage stills, timestamps, staff access logs, a red-circled name she didn't recognize, and several notes in handwriting she assumed was Matteo's. Lorenzo tapped the page once. And someone inside the hospital sold 3 names. Yours was one of them. Izzy stared. 3? The other 2 were decoys, elderly donors, wrong districts. They wanted to see which address my enemies moved on first. They chose yours. Cold moved slowly through her. Why? He looked at her for a long second before answering. Because they learned I asked who donated. That unsettled her more than all the rest. You asked? Yes. Why? His expression changed. Not much, but enough. Because the nurse told me someone wrote on the blood bag. Izzy went still. He said it quietly, almost matter-of-factly. Non morire. Heat rose into her face despite everything. That was stupid. No, he said. It was human. She looked away first. Silence held for a moment. Then Matteo stepped forward. Eyes on Lorenzo's side. Conversation later. You're bleeding through. Izzy glanced down and saw that he was right. The stain had widened. Lorenzo noticed her notice it and straightened instinctively, pride flaring even through obvious weakness. I've had worse. Congratulations, Matteo said flatly. You still need stitches checked. Lorenzo exhaled once through his nose, then looked at Izzy. Stay in this apartment. Do not answer the door to anyone but Matteo. Do not use your own phone. If someone you know calls, you do not tell them where you are. And if I refuse, you won't. Her chin lifted. You sound very sure. His gaze dropped to the bruise inside her elbow, the one left by the donation. Because you already know this is bigger than fear now. Then, before she could answer, his knees almost gave. It was so brief that if Matteo hadn't moved instantly, Giorgio would never have heard it from the other room, and Izzy might have convinced herself she imagined it. Matteo caught his shoulder. Lorenzo swore under his breath, more furious than hurt. Izzy stood frozen. The man who had looked impossible on the gurney, impossible at her door, impossible in her apartment hallway was human after all. Dangerous, yes. Powerful, unquestionably. But human enough to bleed for her twice in a single day, and that, more than the guns or the threats or the changed lock, was the detail that frightened her most. Because now this was no longer just terror. Now it was becoming something harder to survive. For the next hour, the apartment held its breath. Matteo made 2 calls from a secure phone, both short and quiet. Giorgio refused to lie down, so he sat in a straight-back chair near the bedroom door, with his cane across his knees, like he intended to defend his daughter with it if necessary. Izzy stood by the kitchen counter pretending she was only there to boil water, not because it gave her something to hold on to. Lorenzo disappeared into the bathroom with a fresh shirt Matteo pulled from a locked cupboard, and when he came back out, the color in his face had improved only slightly. The clean black shirt hid the blood, but not the strain around his eyes. "You should be in a hospital," Izzy said. He gave her a level look. "The hospital is why we are here. That doesn't make the wound less real." "No, it makes the doctors less trustworthy." He said it like a fact too obvious to discuss, then moved toward the table and sat for the first time since entering the apartment. It was the first truly human thing she had seen him do, not because sitting was intimate, but because he looked like a man who had finally reached the point where standing had become pointless pride. Matteo handed him a glass of water and turned to Izzy. "He's right about one thing. You need the real version now. Not the careful one." "Good," Izzy said, "because I'm done being managed." Lorenzo rested his forearms on the table and looked at her with a kind of tired attention she was beginning to understand was more dangerous than anger. "Then, listen carefully. 3 nights ago, a refrigerated truck belonging to one of my logistics companies went missing between Mestre and the hospital distribution point in Padua. On paper, it carried legitimate medical supplies, plasma storage units, blood transport containers, anticoagulants, transfusion equipment. Nothing unusual. But it was unusual," Izzy said. "Yes. How?" He glanced at Matteo, who pulled a thin folder from his coat and slid it across the table. Izzy opened it and found manifests, shipping documents, photos taken from loading docks, and a page of numbers highlighted in red. "At first," Lorenzo said, "I thought someone was stealing from me. That happens. It's expensive for them when I find out, but it happens. Then I discovered the truck had not gone missing by accident. It had been rerouted, unloaded, repacked, and put back into circulation. The paperwork was adjusted afterward to erase the delay." Izzy looked up. "So someone used one of your shipments, one of my legitimate shipments," he said. "That distinction matters." She almost laughed. "To who?" "To me." That answer should have sounded absurd, but it didn't. He said it with such cold certainty that she believed him. This was a man who likely broke laws by profession, and still maintained categories within his own mind. Lines he could cross, lines he would not. "What was in the truck?" she asked. "Not what the paperwork claimed." This time his voice flattened. "The anticoagulants were counterfeit. Some of the blood transport units were unregistered. A portion of the cargo had already been switched before it ever reached my warehouse. That means whoever built this chain has people in procurement, distribution, and hospital intake." Izzy stared at the papers. "Fake medicine." "Yes. And blood? Likely redirected, relabeled, or sold." The room went very still. Even Giorgio, who had clearly been trying not to follow every word, turned his face toward Lorenzo. "People die from that." "Yes," Lorenzo said quietly. Izzy's fingers tightened on the edge of the folder. "And you found out." "I found enough to become inconvenient." "Is that why they shot you?" "One reason." She looked at him sharply. "There's another." Lorenzo leaned back slightly, and Izzy saw the effort it cost him. The people behind the counterfeit chain were not only stealing from hospitals, they were also using donor records to identify clean, rare blood donors who could be pressured later if needed. She frowned. "Why would anyone do that?" "Because scarcity creates value," Matteo answered. "And value creates leverage." Izzy looked between them. "You're talking about blood like it's currency." Lorenzo's expression did not change. "In the right market, it is." A wave of disgust rolled through her. "You knew this world existed?" "I knew pieces of it existed. I did not know how deep it had gone into the hospitals until 3 days ago. And now I know enough to be shot in a loading bay at 2 a.m. She shut the folder harder than she meant to. "And because I donated, I'm inside it." "You were pulled inside it?" he corrected. "That changes nothing. It changes the part where this was your fault." Izzy let out a sharp breath. "Do not do that." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Do what?" "Speak to me like you can remove guilt just because you say the right sentence in the right tone." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or reluctant respect. "I'm not trying to charm you." he said. No. Her voice rose before she could stop it. You changed my locks, pulled me out of my home, turned my father's morning into a nightmare. And now you're sitting in a safe apartment telling me my blood may have dropped me into a criminal supply chain. That sounds very much like the beginning of a man trying to control the emotional version of the room. Matteo looked toward the ceiling for 1 second, as if asking it for patience. Lorenzo, however, stayed very still. Then he nodded once. That, he said, is fair. The calm acceptance knocked some of the heat out of her anger. He continued before she could answer. I am used to control. I am not apologizing for that because it would be dishonest. But I am telling you the truth now, because if I lie to you, you will either run or make a mistake out of rage. I can survive one of those. I'm less certain you can. The bluntness of it stung because it was so close to useful. Izzy looked down again at the papers. There was a photo paper clipped to the back page, partly obscured. She pulled it free and froze. It showed the inside of a loading area. 2 men were lifting crates out of a refrigerated truck. One crate had broken open at the corner. Inside, beside the packed transfusion equipment, were smaller black cases stamped with a gold symbol she didn't recognize at first. Then she did. A lion with a crown over its head. Her pulse stumbled. What is it? Matteo asked. Izzy held the photo tighter. I've seen this. Lorenzo's attention sharpened instantly. Where? She swallowed. At the workshop. Matteo frowned. Costume workshop? Yes. Lorenzo leaned forward, and though his movement was controlled, there was urgency under it now. Explain. Izzy stared at the symbol. One of Bellini's private clients uses custom trunks with this crest. Not for gowns, those come in garment bags, for masks, jewelry, and whatever else they don't want the assistants touching. The trunks are always delivered by the same service company. Black vans, polite drivers, expensive locks. What client? I don't know his real name. She searched her memory. Bellini calls him Conte Nero behind his back, because he never smiles and always wears black gloves. He buys costumes for private events, masked parties, charity galas. Sometimes he rents whole collections for guests. Matteo and Lorenzo exchanged a look that passed too quickly for her to read. You know him, she said. Lorenzo's voice stayed neutral. I know of him. That means yes. It means he operates through foundations and shell companies, Matteo said. Old money events, hospital fundraisers, restoration committees, church donations, very clean on the surface. Izzy stared at the photo, thinking hard. He was at the workshop on Monday. Are you certain? Yes. Why do you remember Monday specifically? Because that was the day Bellini told me not to look up when the client entered. A humorless half-smile touched Lorenzo's mouth. And did you? Of course. That got a brief, real reaction from Matteo. Something close to amusement. Izzy ignored him and kept going. Bellini had me finish beadwork on a silver half-mask in the back room. The client was speaking on the phone in the front office. He sounded angry. He kept saying the word donors. At the time, I thought he meant gala patrons. Rich people always call themselves donors when they want applause. But now, she looked down at the photo. Now, I don't think he meant money. The apartment fell silent again. Lorenzo stood too quickly, caught the edge of the table, and steadied himself before the movement could become visible weakness. But Izzy saw it. So did Matteo. Sit down, she said, before she could stop herself. Lorenzo looked at her. Sit, she repeated. You don't get to collapse dramatically in the middle of information. Matteo's mouth twitched. To her surprise, Lorenzo sat. That should not have mattered. It did. He folded his hands once, loosely, then looked at her with a concentration that made her wish she had chosen different words, weaker ones, safer ones. Tell me everything you remember about Monday, he said. So she did. She told him about the trunk, the crest, Bellini's nervous behavior, the black-gloved client, and the single phrase she had heard clearly because it had made no sense at the time. Keep the clean list separate from the public list. When she finished, Matteo was already writing it down. Lorenzo did not move for several seconds. Then he said, That is the first useful break we've had since the shooting. Izzy stared. Because of me? Because you listened when other people would have lowered their eyes. She looked away first this time. From the bedroom doorway came the sound of Giorgio's cane tapping once against the floor. Bella, he said, voice tired but sharp, if your workshop is tied to these people, then you are not safe going back there. I know. And if this man's enemies know your address, the apartment is finished. She knew that too. Hearing it said aloud made it worse. Lorenzo rose more carefully this time. You won't go back there alone. That sounds like another order. It is. She opened her mouth to argue. Then Matteo's secure phone rang. All three of them went still. He checked the screen, answered, listened for 10 seconds, and then looked directly at Lorenzo. The nurse from the donor room is gone, he said. She left the hospital 30 minutes after the transfusion. She never got home. Izzy felt the blood drain from her face. Nurse Marja? she whispered. Matteo nodded once. Lorenzo closed his eyes for one short second, then opened them again. When he spoke, his voice had lost what little softness it had developed in the last hour. They moved faster than I thought. Izzy gripped the back of the chair beside her. Because of me? Lorenzo's gaze met hers. Because you are not the only witness anymore. And in that moment, whatever this had been before, an escape, a warning, a debt between a poor girl and a dying man, became something else entirely. A war with a trail, and now she was standing in it. Izzy did not realize until that moment how badly she had wanted Nurse Marja to be irrelevant. A tired nurse with steady hands. A woman doing her job in the wrong place at the wrong hour. That was how Izzy had placed her in her mind. Because the alternative was uglier. The alternative meant Marja had seen something, or helped someone, or simply existed too close to the truth, and now she was gone. What do you mean gone? Izzy asked. Matteo ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Her shift ended at 7. She signed out. Security footage shows her leaving through the staff entrance. After that, nothing. Nothing? Giorgio repeated from the doorway. People do not become nothing. They do in cities like this, Lorenzo said quietly. Izzy hated the way he said it, not carelessly, but like a man who had watched it happen too many times to pretend otherwise. Then we find her. Matteo looked at her. That is the plan. No, she snapped. Not your plan. Mine. You keep saying this is about donor records and supply chains and witnesses, but you still talk like the only people with agency in this room are you and him. That's because we're the ones trained for this. And I'm the one who knows the workshop, she shot back. I'm the one who saw the crest first. I'm the one who heard the client say donors. And if Marzia disappeared because of what she saw the night I donated, and then I am not sitting here while you two decide which parts of my life I'm allowed to participate in. Silence followed that. Matteo glanced at Lorenzo. Lorenzo did not look away from her. He did not raise his voice. He rarely seemed to need to. You want to help? He asked. Yes. Then understand something before we continue. Helping is not the same as winning. It is not the same as being brave. It is not even the same as being useful every minute. Sometimes helping means listening when every instinct in you says run forward. Izzy met his gaze. And sometimes listening is just a more elegant word for obeying. Something unreadable shifted behind his eyes. Then he nodded once. Yes, sometimes it is. That honesty should not have made it easier to trust him. Somehow it did. Matteo set the folder back on the table. Bellini opens the workshop at 10. Private clients usually come after noon. If the black-gloved man is tied to the counterfeit chain, the workshop may be one of several soft fronts used for quiet exchanges. Luxury businesses are useful for that. Rich clients, irregular invoices, delivery traffic no one questions. Izzy thought about the back room, the private fittings, the locked trunks she was never allowed to touch. Things she had filed away as proof of wealth and secrecy, not evidence. Bellini wouldn't survive 5 minutes in a criminal enterprise. He's too nervous. That doesn't mean he hasn't rented space in one, Matteo said. Giorgio made his way slowly to the table and sat with more dignity than comfort. You are not sending my daughter back there alone. No one said alone, Matteo replied. Lorenzo's expression tightened slightly. No. The word was small, but final. Izzy turned to him. What do you mean, no? I mean you are not going back to the workshop. That is not your decision. It is when the people who may be using that place are connected to the men who came to your home this morning. And if I don't go, you lose the only person there who can move naturally through those rooms. He looked at her for a long moment, clearly hating the logic because it was sound. You are not natural anymore, not if they know your name. That depends on whether Bellini knows. And if he does? She had no answer for that. Matteo stepped in before the silence hardened. There may be another way. Bellini trusts her. If she calls and says she's ill, he'll complain, and then tell her to rest. If she says she left something important there last night and needs it, maybe he lets her come after closing. Izzy thought about it. He hates interruptions after 6. If he's with a private client, he would never let me in. That could tell us something too, Matteo said. Lorenzo leaned back slightly, though Izzy could see from the way he controlled the movement that his side was still hurting him. Call him, she frowned. Now? Now. Izzy took out her phone, hesitated, then remembered. You said not to use my own phone. For outside calls, Matteo said. He pulled a small signal shield from his coat and slid it across the table. Put it under. She did as told and dialed Bellini's number from memory. He answered on the 4th ring, already irritated. Isabella, do you have any idea what time it is? It's nearly 10, exactly, which means you're late. She closed her eyes briefly. I'm not coming in this morning. A wounded silence met that. Then Bellini said, You're not what? I'm sick. You were perfectly healthy when I saw you last night. I'm not healthy now. You can be ill on your own time, Isabella. The Lombardi order, I donated blood at a medical office last night, she cut in, adding enough exhaustion to her voice that the lie beneath it disappeared. They called me in for an emergency. I nearly fainted on the walk home. That got his attention. Not concern exactly, but practical alarm. You gave blood without telling me? Are you out of your mind? Your hands shake when you skip lunch, and you thought draining yourself would improve matters? Izzy glanced at Lorenzo. His face had gone still. I didn't plan it, she said. Bellini exhaled sharply. Fine, stay home today. But if you are not back tomorrow, I replace you on the belladonna fittings. Before she could hang up, she asked, Did Contenero come by this morning? The silence on the other end sharpened. Bellini's voice, when it returned, was too casual. Why? No reason. I left my thimble in the back room yesterday. The silver one. I thought maybe if he was there, I'd wait until later. That won't be necessary, Bellini said too quickly. No clients yet. Izzy felt Matteo and Lorenzo both focus on her more closely. Are you sure? She asked. Because I can come by after lunch if— No, Bellini's tone hardened. You said you were ill. Be ill properly, Isabella. We'll speak tomorrow. He ended the call. Izzy set the phone down slowly. He lied, Matteo said. Yes. How do you know? Because he never calls the private clients when he's speaking to staff. He calls them monsters, vultures, parasites, lunatics, depending on the day. If he suddenly said no clients, it means he was choosing his words carefully because he wasn't alone. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. And when you asked about the man you called Contenero, he got protective. Fearful, Matteo corrected. Izzy looked at him. Those are not always the same thing. No, Lorenzo said, but today they are close enough. He reached for the folder again, slid out the photo of the crowned lion crest, and placed it beside a blank sheet. Then he spoke to Matteo without looking away from the image. Check customs records and gala rentals tied to Bellini's workshop in the last 6 months, especially charitable foundations with medical boards attached. If our man uses massed events as cover, he'll repeat routes and vendors. Matteo was already moving toward the secure phone. Izzy stood as well. What do I do? Lorenzo looked up at her. You stay visible. The answer irritated her on principle. That sounds suspiciously like nothing. It means if Bellini calls you back, you answer. If anyone from the workshop texts you, you respond naturally. If you remember another detail, you tell me immediately. And if I decide I need you in the field, you go where I say and leave where I say. You really do hate not being in charge. A faint shadow of humor crossed his face. More than is healthy. Before she could answer, Matteo spoke from the far side of the room. There's more. He came back with his phone and turned the screen toward them. It showed a still image from a hospital service corridor. The timestamp was from early that morning. Nurse Marja stood near a side exit with a bag over her shoulder, head turned toward someone off camera. Her expression was tense, but not terrified. Then Izzy saw the detail that made her stomach drop. Marja was holding a garment sleeve, silver fabric, hand-beaded cuff. Bellini's work. No, Izzy whispered. Matteo looked from the screen to her. You recognize it? That's from the belladonna line. I finished that cuff yesterday. Her voice thinned. That means someone from the workshop met her. Or she met someone from the workshop, Lorenzo said. Izzy stared at the image. Why would Marja have that? Giorgio answered unexpectedly. Because someone gave it to her. They all turned. The old man lifted one shoulder. You rich people think in chains. Sometimes things are simpler. A gift, a signal, a way to tell someone where to go without writing it down. Izzy looked at the screen again, and suddenly he was right. Not a random garment, not a stolen piece, a marker. She was being directed, she said. Lorenzo's gaze sharpened. To where? Her mind moved fast now, not with fear, but with memory. Racks of unfinished costumes, special fittings, delivery schedules, Bellini swearing about a last-minute private showing being moved off-site because those animals wanted candlelight and secrecy and their own damn dock. San Pietro warehouse, she said. Matteo looked up. What? There's an old receiving warehouse near the church docks. Bellini used it twice during Carnival when clients wanted private fittings away from the workshop. No official signs, just a side entrance and a loading dock off the water. If someone wanted to meet a nurse quietly and not be seen coming or going through the main city, they'd use a place tied to costume deliveries. Matteo finished. Lorenzo stood so suddenly the chair legs scraped the floor. This time the pain hit hard enough to show. His hand went to his side, and for one bare second his face lost all its composure. Then it was gone again. Izzy took a step forward before she could think better of it. You are not going anywhere like that in your condition. His eyes found hers. And yet I will. No. The word came out sharper than she intended. More intimate, too. Something changed in his expression, just for a second. Not softness, recognition. Then Matteo said quietly, if she's right, Marja may still be alive. That ended the argument before it began. Lorenzo picked up his coat. Then we move now. Izzy was already reaching for hers. He saw the motion and said, you're not coming. She met his gaze without blinking. Try stopping me. For the first time since entering her life, Lorenzo Ricci looked less like a man issuing orders and more like a man realizing the worst possible truth. The girl who had given him blood, was not built to stand quietly behind glass. And that was going to complicate everything. The argument lasted less than a minute because there was not enough time for a real one. "You are not coming," Lorenzo said again, already reaching for the gun Matteo had set on the sideboard. Izzy grabbed her coat. "Then shoot me in the foot now and save time." Matteo muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like admiration. Lorenzo turned toward her slowly. "You think stubbornness is strategy?" "No," she said. "I think memory is. I know Bellini. I know that warehouse. I know the difference between a private fitting and a private exchange. And right now, both of you are walking toward a trap built partly out of things I can identify faster than you can." He looked ready to refuse again. Then Giorgio spoke from the chair by the wall. "Take her." All three of them turned. The old man lifted his chin, blind eyes fixed somewhere near Lorenzo's voice. "I do not like you. I may never like you, but if my daughter stays here while her mind is out there, and I will spend the next hour listening to her breathe like a trapped thing. Better she goes where she can be useful than stay where she will only imagine the worst." "That is not reassuringly paternal," Matteo said. "It is realistic," Giorgio replied. Lorenzo held Izzy's gaze for another second, then gave one short nod. "You stay between me and Matteo. If either of us tells you to move, you move. If I say down, you do not argue. If Matteo says run, you do not look back." Izzy reached for the handle of the kitchen drawer where Giorgio kept an old fruit knife. Matteo saw it and sighed. "Please don't." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because if this goes badly, that knife will only make me feel guilty." Before she could answer, the secure phone rang again. Matteo listened, spoke quietly, then ended the call and looked at Lorenzo. "Riva is 10 minutes out." "Who's Riva?" Izzy asked. "A doctor," Lorenzo said, "and one of the few people I trust in daylight." True to the estimate, Dr. Riva arrived in under 10 minutes. Mid-40s, no nonsense, dark hair pinned back, medical bag in one hand, and zero visible surprise at finding a frightened girl. A blind old man, a wounded Mafia boss, and a private security officer in a half-abandoned apartment on Giudecca. She checked Lorenzo's side in the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had long ago given up asking whether her patients deserved her honesty. "You tore the stitches," she said flatly. "I noticed. You don't get points for noticing." "I'm not asking for points." "No," she said, glancing at the blood under the edge of the bandage. "You're asking for survival while behaving like an idiot." Izzy would have laughed if the room had not been carrying so much tension. Dr. Riva cleaned and reinforced the wound with quick, practiced hands, then packed fresh dressings into Lorenzo's coat pocket and turned to Izzy. "If he goes gray, he sits. If he says he's fine, he's lying. If he bleeds through again, you press here." She tapped a precise point just below his ribs. "Hard." Izzy nodded before she could think about what that meant. Dr. Riva then checked Giorgio's blood pressure, reset his medication schedule, and quietly told him he was not leaving the apartment under any circumstance. The old man argued just enough to preserve his dignity and then relented, mostly because he knew he had already won the larger battle by sending Izzy with them. 5 minutes later, they were moving. The route to San Pietro warehouse was short if taken by private boat, and shorter still if one knew which canals to avoid. Matteo drove this time, steering a low black launch through the water with one hand and checking corners with the other. Lorenzo sat near the bow in a dark coat, one shoulder turned toward the wind, as if cold were easier to manage than stillness. Izzy sat across from him, silent at first, because there was too much she wanted to say, and none of it felt useful. It was Lorenzo who broke the silence. "Bellini," he said. "How loyal is he?" Izzy thought about the workshop owner with his scented scarves, expensive complaints, and constant terror of displeasing wealthy clients. To money, extremely. To danger, not at all. So he talks if pressed. He talks if stared at by the wrong man. A faint shadow of amusement touched Matteo's face. Lorenzo only nodded. "Good." Izzy looked at him. "You say that like fear is a language." "It is. And you speak it fluently?" His eyes met hers, dark and tired and far too steady. "I grew up in it." She looked away first. By the time the boat reached the service dock behind the warehouse district, the city had shifted into its late morning rhythm. Deliveries, workers, bells. The kind of normal movement that made it easier for ugly things to happen quietly. San Pietro warehouse stood half a block from the water, brick-faced and plain, with 2 shuttered upper windows and a heavy loading door scarred by years of crates and salt. Izzy had been there only twice before, both during carnival rushes when Bellini needed a larger, more private fitting space for wealthy clients who liked secrecy, almost as much as they liked being seen. She knew the front layout well enough, the receiving area, the fitting screens, the garment racks, the back office with the bad lock. More importantly, she knew there was a side entrance accessed through a narrow alley Bellini used when he wanted to move trunks without having the delivery boys gossip. She led them there. The alley smelled faintly of water and old stone. At the far end stood a steel side door, painted the same dull gray as the wall around it. Locked, of course. Matteo crouched, checked the frame, then glanced up. Alarm wire's been cut recently. Meaning? Izzy whispered. Meaning they wanted the door secure, not traceable. Lorenzo stepped close enough that she could feel the heat of him through the cold air. How sure are you about Marzia being inside? I'm not, she admitted. But if Bellini gave her the belladonna sleeve as a signal, and if he uses this place for private exchanges, then this is where I'd start. That's honest, he said. Before she could answer, a sound drifted faintly through the door. A woman coughing, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Matteo and Lorenzo looked at each other once. Then Matteo picked the lock. Inside, the warehouse was dim and colder than the street. She's there. I know, he said. That does not make it clean. Matteo moved around the first rack of costumes with his weapon drawn low and controlled. He checked the blind corners, the floor, the screens, the catwalk above. Lorenzo released Izzy's wrist only to push her gently behind his shoulder. She hated the movement, and hated even more that she let it happen. At the center of the warehouse, half hidden behind 3 rolling mirrors, they found Nurse Marcia tied to a chair. Her mouth was free, but her wrists were bound, and one side of her face was bruised. The silver belladonna sleeve lay on the floor near her feet, like a dropped flag. Her eyes widened the second she saw Izzy. You shouldn't have come, she whispered. That, said a voice from the shadows beyond the racks, is the first wise thing anyone has said all day. Bellini stepped into view first, and for one disorienting second, Izzy nearly felt relief. Then she saw his face. He was terrified. Not guilty, not defensive, terrified. His expensive scarf was missing. His shirt collar hung open. One hand shook so badly he had to use the other to steady it. And behind him, emerging more slowly, came a tall man in a black overcoat and dark gloves. Conte Nero. Only now he wore no mask. He was older than Izzy had expected, perhaps late 40s, with elegant silver at his temples and the polished ease of a man used to entering rooms where everyone already knew his donations, his titles, his charitable boards, and his carefully curated public goodness. She had seen his photograph once in a newspaper clipping Bellini kept, because the man had funded a restoration at a church on Murano. Adriano Valdieri. The recognition must have shown on her face, because his mouth curved. Miss Moretti, he said, how unfortunate that intelligence and poverty so often arrive in the same person. It makes survival difficult. Bellini let out a small, broken sound. I told them not to bring her here. Valdieri didn't even glance at him. You told them many things. That is why your usefulness has an expiration date. Matteo's gun had risen fully now, but not enough, because 2 more men appeared on the upper catwalk, both armed, both angled down. Trap. Izzy felt the word land in her body before anyone said it. Lorenzo, however, did not move. You've become theatrical, Adriano. Valdieri smiled. And you've become sentimental, Enzo. The name hit differently in another man's mouth. Enzo. So that was who Lorenzo Ricci became among people who either knew him well enough to use it or hated him enough to enjoy it. Valdieri gestured lightly toward Marcia. Your nurse saw more than she should have. Your donor remembered more than was convenient. And now here we all are, wasting a beautiful day in a garment warehouse. You stole hospital supply chains, Lorenzo said. Valdieri gave a small shrug. Supply chains, donor records, private requests. The wealthy have always understood one simple truth better than the poor. Life can be extended, improved, or preserved if one is willing to pay enough. I merely organized the market. Izzy felt sick. You mean you sold blood? I mean I sold access, he corrected. Blood, tissue compatibility, donor location, rare type priority. You would be amazed how much people are willing to spend when a child is dying, or an heir needs surgery, or a politician suddenly requires discretion. Bellini made another sound, half sob, half protest. I only rented the space. I didn't know the rest. Valdieri's smile cooled. You knew enough to invoice creatively. Lorenzo's voice dropped. You shot me over invoices. No, Valdieri said softly. I shot you because you started asking where the clean donor list was being stored. Silence spread through the warehouse. Then Marzia, bruised and shaking in the chair, said, It's tonight. Everyone turned. Valdieri's expression hardened for the first time. Marzia looked at Lorenzo, not at Izzy. The list transfer, the real one. Masks and donors and private pledges. Belladonna Hall. Midnight. They're using the foundation ball. Izzy's breath caught. Belladonna Hall was Bellini's biggest contract of the season. A private masked fundraiser held every year in an old palazzo under the excuse of arts preservation and medical philanthropy. Wealthy donors came in costume. Masks were mandatory. Identities blurred. Deliveries came in all day and nobody ever questioned why. Valdieri sighed almost sadly. You see, this is why loose ends become tiresome. His hand moved. So did Matteo's. The first shot shattered one of the mirrors. The warehouse erupted. Matteo fired upward toward the catwalk. Lorenzo shoved Izzy down behind a garment rack so hard she landed on her knees, and in the same movement he turned, drew his own weapon, and fired twice toward the far corner where Valdiri had stood. Marja screamed. Bellini dropped flat to the floor. Glass rained down from another mirror as bullets tore through the fitting screens. Izzy's ears rang. She could not tell who had hit whom. Lorenzo crouched in front of her, one arm braced against the rack, body shielding hers with terrifying instinct. "Stay down. You are literally on top of a fresh wound." "Not the time," Marja cried out again. Izzy looked past his shoulder and saw one of the catwalk gunmen dropping after Matteo's shot, but the second was still there. Bellini was crawling. Valdiri had vanished behind the costume trunks. "We can't leave her," Izzy said. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "I know. That, more than anything, was what cracked something in her chest. Not because he agreed, because he said it like a man already carrying the cost." He fired once more, then looked at her. "When I move, you go to Marcia. Cut her loose. Matteo covers the upper level. Do not chase anyone. Do not look for heroics. You free her and you get behind me again." "Understood?" Izzy swallowed hard. "Understood." He moved before the fear could paralyze her. 2 fast shots, a curse from behind the trunks. Matteo yelling from the far side. Then Lorenzo shifted left, opening the path. Izzy ran. By the time she reached Marcia, the nurse was crying without sound. Izzy pulled the fruit knife from her coat pocket, the one Matteo had dismissed, and sawed at the cords around her wrists with shaking hands. The rope gave. Marcia nearly collapsed into her. "They have the guest masks," Marcia whispered. "The numbered ones. The donor names are inside the black ledger." "Where?" Marcia tried to point. Then a shot cracked from somewhere too close, and Lorenzo turned sharply, taking the impact against his shoulder instead of his chest, only because he had been moving toward them. He staggered. Not dramatic, not loud, but enough. Izzy caught him before she understood she was doing it, one hand against his arm, the other against the hot wetness spreading through his coat. His face had gone white with fury, rather than pain. "Enzo!" Matteo barked from across the room. The name left no room for civility, no room for titles. Enzo looked down once at Izzy's bloodless face, and then back toward the smoke and torn fabric where Valdiri had escaped. "We're leaving," he said. It was the last thing he wanted, and that was how Izzy knew the situation had become worse than even he would admit. They got out of the warehouse by force of timing more than control. Matteo covered the rear exit while Izzy half-supported Marcia, and Lorenzo somehow kept moving under his own power. Though the fresh blood darkening his shoulder said movement was costing him more than he would ever admit. Bellini stumbled after them, sobbing apologies to no one in particular, too frightened to run in any direction except the one Lorenzo's people had chosen. By the time they reached the service dock, another boat was already waiting. Matteo had called it in before the last shots stopped echoing. Only when they were safely away from the warehouse, cutting across the water toward a different hideout near Dorsoduro, did the silence in the boat become unbearable. Marcia sat hunched beneath a blanket, wrists rubbed raw, face gray with shock. Bellini kept whispering, I didn't know, until Matteo finally told him, in a voice so calm it sounded almost kind, that if he repeated that sentence one more time, he would be gagged for the rest of the ride. Bellini stopped. Izzy knelt in front of Lorenzo with both hands pressed hard against his shoulder, through the coat he had refused to remove. The bullet had torn through the upper part of the shoulder rather than burying deep, but there was enough blood to remind her how quickly a man could fade even when he still looked dangerous. His face had gone quiet in that particular way men wore pain when they did not trust the room to see it. Keep pressure, he said. I am. You're shaking. You've been shot twice in less than 24 hours. Forgive me if my hands are not elegant. That almost got a smile out of him. Almost. By the time they reached the apartment, a different one this time, smaller, more secure, hidden behind a locked courtyard entrance off a narrow calle near the university, Dr. Riva was waiting again. She did not bother asking how he had managed to reopen one wound and collect another before lunchtime. She simply cut his sleeve open, cleaned the shoulder wound, and informed him that if he tried to leave again in the next hour, she would personally sedate him and chain him to the bed. I believe you, he said. You should. Izzy stood beside the table, while Marcia drank sugared tea, and Bellini sweated into a handkerchief on the far side of the room. Matteo searched the contents of the bag they had taken from the warehouse, and laid everything out with ruthless precision. A ring of keys, burner phones, delivery receipts, 2 access badges for Belladonna Hall, and a small brass token stamped with the same crowned lion crest. But there was no ledger. Valdiri had escaped with it. For a while, That fact sat in the room like another armed man. Then Marja spoke. The ledger isn't the only copy. Everyone turned. She took a shaky breath. Not a paper copy, a transfer copy. They encoded tonight's donor list into the numbered masks for Belladonna Hall. Izzy frowned. What does that mean? Marja looked at her. The fundraiser uses private patron masks every year, right? Hand-fitted, numbered, cataloged. The wealthy guests love the ritual of it. They arrive, present their invitation, and the steward gives them the corresponding mask from the private collection. This year, Valdiri had an extra system added. Inside the lining of selected masks, there are stitched number sequences. Most people would think they're inventory marks. They're not. They correspond to donor files. Bellini made a strangled sound. Madonna. Matteo leaned forward. And the black ledger? Cross-reference key, Marzia said. The masks carry coded strings. The ledger translates them into real names, blood types, medical notes, locations, emergency contacts, everything. Izzy stared. You're telling me they turned a charity ball into a donor auction? No one corrected her. Lorenzo, seated now because Dr. Riva had made standing physically impossible, looked at Marja with frightening stillness. How do you know this? Marja swallowed. Because one of the lab runners bragged after too much wine. He said the rich liked pretending they were patrons of life while shopping for it in secret. I thought he was disgusting, but exaggerating. Then I saw one of the lists, and the night you came in shot, I realized the clean donor list had been pulled from secure storage hours before the attack. That's when I understood what they were doing. Dr. Riva, who had finished binding Lorenzo's shoulder, straightened slowly. If that mask transfer happens tonight, they can burn the paper trail tomorrow and still move names quietly for months. Lorenzo nodded once, which means tonight ends it. Izzy already knew what he was going to say before he looked at her. No, she said. He ignored that and turned to Matteo. We get inside before the auction. We take the ledger, the masks, and Valdiri if possible. His financial coordinator too, if she's there. Bellini jolted. Claudia Veri, she handles all private patron assignments. She knows the numbering system. Good, Matteo said. Now we have another name. Bellini looked ready to be sick. Izzy stepped forward. You are not doing this without me. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. Wrong. Belladonna Hall is Bellini's event. Half the staff know me. I fitted 3 of the guest capes myself. I know the layout backstage better than Matteo does, and probably better than you do. I'll learn. You'll bleed on polished marble and ruin the evening, she snapped. That is not the same thing. Matteo turned his face slightly, hiding what looked very much like amusement again. Lorenzo rose despite Dr. Riva's glare. He did it carefully, but the movement still cost him. Listen to me very closely, Isabella. She hated when he used her full name. It meant he was either furious or trying to force distance where there was none. You have already been chased from your home, turned into leverage, a shot at in a warehouse, and dragged into a criminal network because you chose to help a dying man. I will not take you into Belladonna Hall unless there is no other way. She held his gaze. There is no other way. Silence. It stretched long enough for Dr. Riva to gather her supplies, decide this argument belonged to people with less medical sense than she possessed, and retreat toward the kitchenette where Bellini was trying not to faint. Lorenzo looked at Izzy for so long that the rest of the room seemed to dim around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. At the hospital, he said. When they told me someone had donated, I asked who because I wanted to understand why I was still alive. Then Marja showed me the bag. Heat moved up the back of Izzy's neck. Non morire, he said quietly. She swallowed. It was stupid. No. His gaze did not leave hers. It was the first honest thing anyone had given me in a very long time. Something inside her chest tightened painfully. He continued before she could speak. That is why I came to your door myself. Not because I thought you belonged to a debt. Not because I wanted gratitude. Because I knew if someone had enough humanity to write that on a blood bag for a stranger, then my world would devour her if I arrived too late. The room had gone so quiet that even Matteo stopped pretending not to listen. Izzy's voice came out softer than she wanted. You barely knew me. I still barely know you. That's not reassuring either. A tired ghost of a smile touched his mouth. No. She looked at the fresh bandage on his shoulder, the older one beneath his shirt, the strain he was still hiding badly. Then stop acting like you get to decide what danger is mine to face and what danger isn't. His expression changed at that. Not softened. Something deeper. More reluctant. More real. The look of a man who understood he was losing an argument, not because he lacked power, but because the other person had struck the one place power could not solve. You think this is about pride, he said. Isn't it? In part. He did not even bother lying. But mostly it is about consequence. If you walk into Belladonna Hall with me, there is no version of your life that returns to simple afterward. She almost laughed. Simple ended when I opened my door this morning. That landed. She saw it. For one brief second, regret crossed his face so nakedly that it made him look younger and infinitely more dangerous. Then Matteo cleared his throat and mercifully, brought the room back to logistics. We're wasting time. If she goes as staff, not as a guest. Fewer eyes, more movement. Bellini can get her backstage access without raising suspicion. Bellini startled. Me? Yes, you, Matteo said. You owe the universe a debt the size of Venice. Start paying. Bellini looked at Lorenzo, who said only, You will do exactly as you are told. Bellini nodded so fast it looked painful. The plan came together in hard, practical pieces after that. Bellini would arrive at the hall under his own name with 2 assistants. One would be Izzy. The other would be Matteo in servant black, because, as Bellini put it with a faint tremor, no one ever really sees staff unless they spill wine. Lorenzo would enter separately later in the evening, masked as one of the last private patrons, because Valdieri expected him either absent or reckless, never careful. Margia and Dr. Riva would stay behind in the apartment under guard. Giorgio, who had been moved there during the chaos of the last hour, argued only once before accepting that blindness and stubbornness did not qualify him for gala infiltration. Izzy changed in the bedroom Bellini was using to calm down. There was no gown this time, and no luxury chosen to make her look like she belonged beside a dangerous man. Bellini had emergency tailoring cases in the trunk Matteo had seized, and from those cases Izzy built a different version of herself. Fitted black trousers, a cream silk blouse, a simple dark jacket, hair pinned up the way workshop assistants wore it during elite fittings, face polished but understated, invisible in the correct way, useful, allowed to move. When she came back into the sitting room, Bellini looked relieved, Matteo approving. And in Lorenzo looked at her the way he had in the donor corridor before he knew her name, as if his mind had already adjusted the room around her, and did not appreciate being caught doing it. You pass, he said. She lifted a brow. That almost sounded like praise. It was operational. Of course it was. Bellini fussed with the fall of her sleeve and whispered, Do not improvise unless absolutely necessary. That is rich coming from you. I am sincere when terrified. Matteo checked his watch. We leave in 8 minutes. One by one, the room's scattered energy gathered into resolve. Bellini took the invitation packet. Matteo concealed a slim weapon at the base of his spine. Izzy slipped the brass lion token into her pocket in case it matched something inside the hall. Lorenzo remained near the window, fastening the cuff of a dark formal coat over his fresh bandage, his movements precise and slower than usual. When the others stepped briefly into the corridor to coordinate exit timing, he looked at Izzy and said, very quietly, If this turns, and I tell you to leave, you leave. She shook her head. No. His jaw tightened. Izzy, don't. She stepped closer, and lowering her voice too. Don't suddenly become noble now. It doesn't suit you. Something dangerously close to warmth moved behind his eyes. You think you know what suits me? I know what doesn't. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Then he lifted his hand, very slowly, giving her every chance to refuse, and touched 2 fingers lightly to the inside of her wrist, the place where the hospital bandage had been that morning. The gesture was so small it almost undid her. If I had died, he said quietly, your life would have stayed simpler. She met his gaze. Maybe, but then you wouldn't be here, and somehow that feels like the worst bargain. He inhaled once, sharply, as if she had struck something under the ribs no bullet had reached. Matteo reappeared in the doorway. I hate interrupting whatever terrifying thing this is becoming, but the car is ready. Izzy stepped back first. Lorenzo's hand fell to his side, and together they moved toward Belladonna Hall, where masks, donors, money, and blood were waiting to be sorted by the kind of people who thought life could be purchased if one dressed the room beautifully enough. Belladonna Hall had always belonged to other people. Izzy had seen it only in fragments before. Delivery doors, garment corridors, the narrow staircase used by staff carrying boxes of masks and embroidered capes. She had never entered through the front, never stood beneath the chandeliers, never watched Venice's wealth gather under painted ceilings and call itself generosity. Tonight, the palazzo was lit for spectacle. Music carried through the marble corridors. Footmen in black moved like punctuation marks between clusters of masked guests. Gold candles burned in mirrored niches. Laughter rose and fell in careful waves. Everything gleamed. And beneath all that polish, donor names were being traded like favors. Bellini led the way with trembling dignity, greeting the front steward by name, and complaining immediately about humidity levels, feather damage, and the impossibility of maintaining silk when rich people insisted on arriving late. The performance was perfect, because none of it was performance for him. He was, Izzy realized, nowhere more convincing than when he was anxious and offended at the same time. Matteo followed 1 pace behind, carrying a garment case, and wearing the blank expression of an expensive employee. Izzy kept her chin lowered, clipboard in hand, exactly as an assistant would. Nobody stopped them. Nobody really saw them. That, more than anything, made the evening feel rotten. People who thought themselves powerful never truly looked at the people serving them. It was what made systems like this possible. The first critical detail appeared in the receiving antechamber where the private masks were kept before being assigned. There were 42 of them. Each rested in a black presentation box lined with cream velvet, tagged with a patron number. Some were lacquered, some feathered, some jeweled to vulgarity. Izzy moved along the row under the pretense of checking Bellini's finishing work, while Bellini argued with a steward about handling protocols. On the inside band of every sixth mask, stitched so discreetly it might have been mistaken for atelier code, she found tiny numeric patterns in silver thread. Marja had told the truth. She managed not to react, and simply kept moving until she reached the end of the table, where a black leather ledger should have been. It wasn't there. Instead, Claudia Very stood beside the rear partition, speaking softly to two men in tuxedos. She was younger than Izzy expected, maybe 35, elegant in a severe way, with dark hair pinned cleanly, and no visible ornament except a narrow diamond bracelet. If Valdieri was the public face of cultivated philanthropy, Claudia looked like the person who made his elegance profitable. She dismissed the men, then turned toward the masks. Izzy bent immediately over one of Bellini's capes as though the hem had become urgent. Claudia's gaze passed over her and paused only briefly on Bellini, whose terror sharpened into theatrical irritation. "Signora Very," he said, drawing himself up, "if your people continue touching the masks with bare hands, I refuse responsibility for the finish." Claudia gave him a cool smile. "Then it's fortunate no one has hired you for responsibility, Signor Bellini. Only for beauty." Bellini looked mortally offended, which in this case helped. Claudia moved on. The moment she vanished through the inner archway, Matteo murmured, "Back room, left corridor." Izzy nodded once. Bellini continued complaining loudly enough to anchor the room while Matteo adjusted the garment case and drifted after Claudia with the unremarkable efficiency of a servant who belonged wherever he walked. Izzy waited 3 long seconds, then picked up a tray of fastening pins and followed at a more natural pace. The left corridor led away from the ballroom toward the private patron suites, smaller salons where the wealthiest guests drank better champagne, negotiated quieter deals, and pretended the rest of the city did not exist. At the far end stood a lacquered door, guarded by one man in formal black. Not security in uniform. Worse, the kind of guard meant to disappear into luxury. Matteo crossed first, murmured something about final adjustments for Patron 27, and was waved through after a barely interested glance. Izzy approached 10 seconds later carrying the tray. Signora Very requested replacement hooks for the silver mantles. The guard looked at her, then at the tray, then opened the door with obvious boredom. Inside, the room was smaller than she expected, and much uglier in purpose than in design. A long table stood under a frescoed ceiling. On it sat the ledger, 3 open mask boxes, 2 laptops, and a stack of donor files banded in black ribbon. Valdieri stood near the mantel in a formal evening mask that left his mouth visible, speaking with Claudia and a gray-haired man Izzy recognized from a newspaper as the director of a private medical foundation. 2 more masked guests were examining one of the coded mask linings with interest far too clinical to be accidental. Izzy's stomach turned. This was not symbolic, not rumor, not theory. It was commerce. Claudia saw her first. "What is that?" Izzy lifted the tray slightly. "Replacement hooks, Signora. I asked for them 10 minutes ago. I came as fast as they would permit." Claudia's gaze sharpened. "Who sent you?" Before Izzy could answer, a new voice entered the room. "I did. Lorenzo." He came through the opposite door in a dark evening coat and plain black mask, looking every inch like a man invited, because money had long ago stopped being a question around him. Yet nothing about him was relaxed. His movements were too deliberate, his shoulders too still. The fresh bandage beneath his formal shirt remained hidden, but Izzy could feel the tension in him from across the room. Valdieri turned slowly. "Enzo," he said, almost warmly, "I wondered whether you would choose anger or caution. I should have known you would try to dress anger as caution." Lorenzo removed his gloves 1 finger at a time. "You built a market out of hospital theft and donor files." Valdieri shrugged. "I built access. The city was already for sale." The gray-haired foundation director shifted uneasily. Claudia, by contrast, went colder. "You should not have come here wounded." Lorenzo's gaze never left Valdieri. "You should not have mistaken wounded for weak." Everything after that happened on 2 levels at once, the polished and the violent. The polished level was words, Valdieri insisting this was private patronage, Lorenzo forcing him to define the patronage aloud, Claudia arguing medical discretion, elite contingency care, donor matching as a matter of necessity, the foundation director trying very hard not to hear himself implicated. The violent level lived underneath, Matteo moving into position near the door, Izzy edging closer to the table, the guard outside no longer bored, the coded masks laid out like invitations to damnation. Valdieri smiled faintly. "You of all men should appreciate supply, demand, and the value of loyalty." "I appreciate lines," Lorenzo said. "And yet here you are, pretending you have them." That landed harder than the others. For the first time, Izzy saw Lorenzo's anger without its usual discipline around the edges. Not louder, not wilder, just stripped bare. "You used public hospitals," he said softly. "You used donor files. You put armed men into a blood chain and called it efficiency." Valdiri's smile faded. "And you move half this city through fear and call it order. Spare me moral theater." Izzy realized then what Lorenzo had meant about lines. Men like these could both be dangerous, both be powerful, both be guilty of shaping cities to their own logic. But Valdiri had crossed into something Lorenzo genuinely despised. Not just theft, not just corruption. Profiting from helplessness at the moment blood itself was needed. That was the line. Claudia reached for the ledger. Izzy moved first. She swept the tray hard across the table. Pins scattered. Boxes crashed. The ledger slid toward the edge, just as Matteo lunged from the doorway, and the room finally abandoned all pretense. The guard outside pushed in with his weapon raised. Matteo hit him before he cleared the threshold. Claudia snatched for one of the donor files and got only paper. The foundation director stumbled back swearing. Valdiri went for the ledger, but Lorenzo was faster. The two men collided against the table with enough force to overturn a lamp. Izzy grabbed the ledger. It was heavier than it looked, thick with names and tabs and cross-references. One of the laptops hit the floor and skidded under a chair. Claudia came at her with surprising violence, reaching not like an elegant administrator, but like a woman who understood exactly how much ruin sat in Izzy's hands. Izzy drove her shoulder forward out of instinct rather than skill. Claudia staggered. Matteo shouted something. Lorenzo and Valdiri slammed into the mantel. A gun fired somewhere behind her, the sound deafening in the enclosed room. Then the ballroom doors opened, music faltered, voices rose. Masked guests turned toward the private suite entrance just as Bellini, God help him, did the bravest thing he had done in his entire perfumed life. He screamed, not delicately, not convincingly, with the full unhinged force of a man who had finally decided terror might as well become usefulness. "Fire!" he shrieked into the corridor. "Fire in the patron suites!" Panic was immediate and glorious. The polished world outside the room shattered faster than any glass. Guests surged. Footmen ran. Someone rang the emergency bell. Someone else shouted for water. Police. Doctors. In the confusion, the private became public. The one thing Valdiri had needed to avoid. Claudia saw it too and lunged again. Not for Izzy now, but for the nearest coated masks. Izzy made a split-second decision and did the one thing no one expected. She tore the nearest mask lining open with both hands and flung the silver-threaded inner band into the middle of the corridor where fleeing guests could see it. Then she did it again. And again. Numbers, hidden stitches, coated strips, suddenly visible under chandelier light and everyone's alarm. "What are you doing?" Claudia shouted. "Ending your privacy," Izzy shot back. By then Matteo had the foundation director on the floor and the guard disarmed. Bellini was still screaming. The corridor beyond filled with witnesses. Lorenzo and Valdiri were locked in close, brutal motion near the mantel. Neither man fighting beautifully, both fighting to finish. Valdiri reached for a fallen pistol. Izzy saw it first. "Enzo!" Lorenzo turned at the sound of his name and drove Valdiri's wrist down hard against the stone hearth. The gun discharged into the floor. Matteo crossed the room in 2 strides and kicked it away. Everything stopped. Not neatly, not cleanly, but decisively. A minute later, with real police forcing their way through the outer hall and wealthy patrons shouting about scandal and smoke and assault, the room had become impossible to contain. Claudia was handcuffed after trying, absurdly, to claim the donor files were for philanthropic triage. The foundation director had gone gray and speechless. Valdiri, elegant even with blood on his mouth, said nothing at all as Lorenzo stood over him, and the black ledger lay open on the floor between them, like a sentence finally spoken aloud. When the first officer demanded to know who was in charge, 5 people spoke at once. Bellini was one of them. 2 hours later, the sky above Venice had gone from black to the thin blue of early dawn. Statements had been taken in fragments. Lawyers had arrived. Names had started moving up official chains too visible to bury quickly. The donor files, the masks, the laptop copies, the ledger, all of it had become evidence before anyone loyal to Valdiri could make it disappear. Marzia's testimony, once she was brought under protection, would finish what the room had begun. Izzy stood on the landing outside Belladonna Hall, with her coat wrapped tightly around her, and felt the delayed shaking finally begin. Lorenzo came out a minute later. He had removed the mask. Without it, he looked older, more tired, and somehow more honest. Blood had dried at the edge of his cuff. His shoulder was still bandaged beneath the torn formal coat. The bruising at his temple had darkened, but his eyes were clear. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "You destroyed the masks in the corridor." "Yes, that was reckless." "Yes." A faint, exhausted smile touched his mouth. "It was also effective." She looked down at the stone steps. "I didn't know how else to make the room too public to save." "You knew exactly how." Silence again. Not awkward, just full. Then he stepped closer, slow enough that she could have moved away if she wanted. "I said simple ended when you opened the door," he murmured. "It did, and I said I came because I refused to let my world devour you." She met his gaze. "It didn't." "No," his voice dropped. "Because you fought back." Something in her chest ached at that, at the respect in it, the lack of ownership. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Valdyri falls. Claudia talks or tries not to. Bellini survives by becoming useful to prosecutors. Marcia gets protection. Your father gets a safer apartment before nightfall. And you..." He stopped there. "And me?" His expression changed, very slightly. "You get to decide whether this is where I leave." It would have been easier if he had ordered, easier if he had assumed, easier if he had become the version of himself everyone warned her about. Instead, he stood there wounded and dangerous, and entirely too careful with her freedom. She thought of the hospital chair, the blood bag, the note she had written for a stranger, the knock on the door, her father in the apartment, the warehouse, the masks, the ledger, the fact that at every turn, Lorenzo Ricci had been most frightening not when he controlled people, but when he chose not to. "I don't think you get to vanish after this," she said. The ghost of that tired smile returned. "No, no." He took one more step closer. "Isabella, Izzy," she corrected softly. His eyes warmed in a way she would never fully trust and would probably never stop wanting. "Izzy, if I stay honestly. No debt, no possession, no gratitude demanded." She swallowed. "And no deciding for me what danger I'm allowed to face. That one," he admitted, "may take practice." Despite everything, a laugh escaped her. It broke the last of the tension. He lifted his hand slowly, gave her time, and touched her face with fingertips still cool from the night air. When she didn't move away, he leaned in and kissed her, not like a conqueror, not like a man collecting a prize, but like someone who had nearly died twice in one day and understood the value of being allowed anything at all. When he pulled back, dawn had started to touch the canal water below the steps. Venice looked almost innocent again. It wasn't. Maybe it never would be. But Isabella Moretti, poor girl with tired hands and overdue rent and too much heart for the life she had been given, had opened a door that morning expecting fear on the other side. Instead, she had found danger, blood, truth, and a man who learned too late that the life he wanted to protect would not be protected quietly. And when her life changed forever, it was not because he dragged her into his world. It was because, after all the masks came off, she chose not to walk away from what they had become.